Depression is said to be a problem of chemical imbalances. Of course, whenever they say there's a chemical imbalance, they're hiding in a smokescreen of ambiguity because they don't know what they're talking about. People who trust experts blindly are just as foolish as people who believe doctors when they told them it's alright to smoke, it's good for you. Doctors recommended smoking. If you look at the history of experts, you'll see they were always wrong about one thing or another. Sure, they were always right about one thing or another, but they're also always wrong about one thing or another. There is no exception in every generation. Why would your generation suddenly have reached total enlightenment? That's absolute arrogance and ignorance of history and the current situation of how the establishment is full of paid shells who are paid to lie, paid to promote by their research, have propaganda supporting lies, like the lie that the brain is the mind. So I was looking at this video called Vincent van Gogh Visits an Art Gallery or whatever, and this guy said, and oh, his name is French, so you already know he's a liberal, because you know how the French are. They're like at the epicenter of liberal insanity, because that's where Napoleon is from. Napoleon was a libtard who served the synagogue of Satan, and his mission was to undermine Gentile monarchies, because according to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which I plan to do a video covering, was not based on any other work per se, because it is alleged to be a hoax, anti-Semitic. I worship the King of the Jews. I am not anti-Semitic. I love his race more than any liberal. So anyway, Napoleon is from France, of course, and well, Corsica, arguably Italian. But France was where the virus of liberalism exploded from by the bloody French Revolution, and that's how liberal nonsense spread by the sword. Liberals can't spread their cancer by reason, and never has reason. It has only nonsense and fallacies to support it. Here is a guy doing circular reasoning that depression is merely an originally physical problem. The best part of this is that, despite hearing the praise and how he considered as the best painter, it doesn't change fact. A lot of people tend to forget that the pressure isn't so bad telling someone they're great. It takes time and constant reassurance, or maybe every so often you fall right back to rock bottom, but with support you can recover. Van Gogh doesn't have that support this time, in his time. Whenever he falls on a hard time, blah blah blah. So, depression isn't solved by blah blah blah. You can recover. He's treating this like a disease because he's indoctrinated to treat it as if it were just another physical disease like the cold or a fever. So here is how I prove atheists wrong again, which is easy. Depression is a spiritual condition that atheists don't understand because they refuse to think outside the box of nature, confusing the brain, which is a slave to physics, with a free to think mind. Slave ain't free. That's a contradiction. You liberals, you atheists contradict yourselves. You pretend to know what you're talking about, but you don't even understand that free doesn't equal slave. You contradict yourselves and you're not even aware of the contradiction. You're that blind. You're that deluded by materialism. You can't think outside the box of nature because you were taught nature is all there is. Don't think outside the box. If you do, you're a religious extremist. Only religious extremists think outside the box. So it's a contradiction, which means it's impossible for the mind to be physical. And this proves that the mind will continue after death. Sadness is a mental and therefore metaphysical thing, which manifests in physical ways, that is all. Just because it manifests in physical ways doesn't mean it's physical, because the spirit is connected to the mind. How? It's magic. And if you have a problem with magic, then you're a massive hypocrite, because atheists believe in magic more than anyone else. They believe in abiogenesis, which is unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific sci-fi shit. I always challenge them. Give me a plausible falsification for your slime became Frankenslime, which is absolutely extremely magical and unscientific. to prove that it's a scientific explanation. You don't even have to prove that it's true. Just prove that it's a scientific explanation. You're alchemy on steroids. So don't mock magic when you're full of it. And the worst kind of magic. Irrational, nonsense magic. By not understanding that the problem is metaphysical, materialists deal only with physical symptoms of the problem, which is a very profitable deception to psychiatrists, pseudoscientists, pseudo-doctors who specialize in talking shit and pretending to know what they're talking about and using arbitrary, subjective, unscientific terms to describe your suffering. They feed on your suffering, and then you give them a big amount of money, and they say come back so that you can talk more about your problems that they never really solve, because the drugs they recommend, they're drug dealers. The drug, for crying out loud, the drugs they recommend to you mask the problem. If you're sad and then you're injected with some morphine or something, oh, you're so high, you're so active, that means you're happy, right? No, it means you're a drug addict now. And that doesn't solve the problem, that makes it worse. But of course, you know, people are superficial and they want to fit in and not question what they're taught, because it's easy to not question what you're taught. And to fit in is easy because you don't have to think to fit in. You just believe whatever they say. You don't think for yourself. It's easy. And you know, Socrates was murdered by Athens' democracy, for telling people to think for themselves. So democracies aren't enlightened. They're actually in a dark age. Worse than the so-called dark age. Because in the so-called dark age, well, just compare a king who is sometimes unjust versus democracy, which is often unjust. Two wolves deciding what to have for dinner with a lamb. That's democracy. In both cases, they're unjust, right? But in one case, they're at least efficient because they don't have to wait for votes and all that. And votes don't matter. What matters is who counts the votes. But I digress, as always. So you're always missing the root of the problem because you deal only with the symptoms, with drugs that only mask the problem. You don't solve it. So you're always incapable of solving the problem of depression. Now, if depression is a problem, then you may as well assume everything is a physical problem that can be solved with drugs, right? So, let's see. I'm thinking about rapists. How would they solve the problem of rape? Well, in their case, they cannot solve it, of course. So what they do is they give the rapist a free paid vacation to play in a gym and watch TV, where if they're in Norway, they live in a more luxurious place than most houses in the world. Because liberals aren't just, and they like to reward criminals. So the same people who are insane enough to believe that depression is just a physical thing are also insane enough to reward criminals. You guys are part of the problem. And societies like yours, where drunkenness isn't a crime because you have low, shitty atheist standards, self-righteously cherry-picked ethics, bigoted opinions imposed on others, because you have your shitty atheistic standards, drunkenness is not a crime. And drunkenness is one of the reasons that families are ruined. Drunkenness is one of the reasons that society is full of shit and full of sad people. So you are part of the problem, liberals. So, yeah. Check out my many videos proving atheists wrong about everything. Try why quantum physics is pseudoscience, which I plan a part 2 on. And I plan to feature Tom Cruise, not to be confused with Tom Cruise with a K, the inventor of the hover-round, but rather the other guy. He's a funny guy. I like the video of him killing Oprah. Atheists citing brain scans are just confusing correlation with causation, because atheists can't tell the difference between correlation and causation. But they think they're so smart. Tell me, materialists. Don't run from the question, you cowards. If the Nintendo 64 controller is broken, is the player dead? Because atheists look at a brain scan, they're like, look, we see the brain stops working, so he's dead, right? He can't think anymore, right? Wrong. You have not proven that. Because not only have I already proven that the mind continues after death, but I have already proven that the mind is free to think, therefore not a slave to physics. Oh, what's that? You don't accept the premise that the mind is free to think. What you're saying is you're not able to think. You're saying you're not free to think. You're saying you're incapable of thinking. That is how stupid you sound. That is what you have resorted to defend atheism and its implications of materialism, of nature always exists, something science never says. By the way, the first law of thermodynamics has been used by atheists, misused, to try to prove that nature is all that exists. The first law of thermodynamics, if I recall correctly, because it's been years, is that nature cannot be created nor destroyed. So they're like, God couldn't have created it. Well, that's absolute nonsense, because look at the context. The context is scientists find nature already existing, which they can't account for, ultimately. To say that an explosion led to the universe, which is absolute nonsense, see my videos on the Big Bang. I'm looking at the time here, 11 minutes. That doesn't explain where energy came from. And so, no. So they can't even explain where energy came from. And, let's see. So, first law of thermodynamics says nature cannot be created or destroyed. What that is just an observation of nature as we see it after it's already been created. So it doesn't prove it wasn't created. Because what began is it existed somehow, was created. Now, if you want to imagine it was by an explosion or whatever you want to imagine, or that it always existed, which is nonsense, I plan to do a video on that. Actually, I'll do it right now. The second law of thermodynamics, extrapolated backwards, means that nature could not have always existed. Because entropy, which reflects that second law, says that energy disperses to where there is less. So originally, like over time, given enough time, energy will disperse to where there's an equilibrium, or in so far as that can be reached. So before that, there was a point at which all of the energy was as concentrated as possible. It has always been constantly, spreading out, losing its concentration, diluting, as it were. So ultimately, there was a point at which it was as concentrated as could be, and before that point, the second law could not have applied. Because how can you have entropy after which you have the maximum level of order concentrated possible? The heat birth, the opposite of the heat death, where there's a massive dispersal and equilibrium of energy. Therefore, the second law could not have applied. Therefore, the second law began to apply there. The second law describes energy's behavior. So if the second law did not begin to apply, neither did energy exist. So that is the point at which energy began to exist. That is the point at which nature began to exist. Energy and matter are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. So that is when nature began to exist. So the second law of thermodynamics, extrapolated backwards, proves, logically, nature had to have begun. Atheists can't say, oh, it always existed. Now, God can always exist because the reason we know things have a cause is by the cause and effect law, the law of cause and effect, which is an observation of things that are physical. So it's a physical law. It applies only to natural things necessarily, not to a supernatural agent like God. 1 minute left. All right, so I proved nature couldn't always exist. I proved the mind is supernatural. I proved that there is an afterlife. What else have I done in this video, which anyone else can do, but few people bother to look into the issues as much as I have? So I'm not boasting here. And also, to defeat atheists is just defeating paper tigers. Anyone can blow over a sheet of paper. Paper tiger. So yeah, so materialism is nonsense. Think outside the box of nature. Nature isn't all that exists. I've already proven that. And stop being drug addicts. Stop falling for the psychiatry nonsense.